Hey guys, I want to take 2 seconds and talk about thermostatic expansion valves, specifically made by Sporlan. How you can always have the right TXV for the right application without having to carry hundreds of TXVs on your truck. Use a Sporlan's interchangeable cartridge style Type Q conventional and Type BQ balance port TXVs. It's easy as 1, 2, 3. It serves about 1,000 different unique applications. All you have to do is select the body, select the cartridge, and select power head for it. These easy to select and assemble valves means that you always carry the right valve for the right job. For more on Q and BQ TXVs, visit www.sporlan.com.
We've all been there, in the middle of a job, everything going smoothly, until boom, you're missing a part. United Refrigeration is your one-stop shop for all your refrigeration needs. Use your computer or smartphone to go to www.uri.com at any time of day or night to check stock on your favorite brands, such as Copeland, Sporlan, Carlisle compressors, Danfoss, Emerson CPC boards and sensors, Carrel, Hussmann parts, and K2Therm. United Refrigeration Inc. is home to these brands and many more. Looking for information on refrigerant conversions or refrigerant banking? Quick access links on the homepage can get you to the information you need. All approved accounts are able to see live to-the-minute inventory and pricing. Product not in stock at your local branch? No problem. Use the Nearby Stock feature to find a local branch that does have what you need. Are you looking for a branch address, phone number, or after-hours number? That's all available as well. Just click on the branch locator and search for your local branch. Have a model number and looking for a replacement part? www.uri.com/ARP has a vast list of quick pick replacement parts. Just search for the model number of the equipment you're working on and click the Replacement Parts tab. If you don't have an account, click the Register button and we'll have you online in no time. With more than 400 locations in North America, each United Refrigeration branch is fully stocked for immediate pickup. Our branch employees have in-depth technical knowledge, so we can help you get what you need when you need it. Visit your local store or www.uri.com/ARP today. United Refrigeration Inc. has all your solutions down cold.
Yeah, it better be, because tonight we're keeping score.
Yes, and on a scale of 1 to 10, here's your score so far.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Advanced Refrigeration Podcast. You're here with your host, Brett Wetzel, Kevin Compass, and we have a special guest from KeepRite Refrigeration, Norman Haimes. How you doing, sir?
Pretty good. Thanks for having me on.
So tonight we're having Norman come on to talk about some of the KeepRite stuff. The box sizing we're going to touch on a little bit, and I know this has been as a discussion on a lot of the different forums about how the 2-speed fans are supposed to work, when they're supposed to be running in low speed, when they're running in high speed, what could potentially happen if we do run it in low speed during defrost, and the potential defrost issues that we could actually happen. Norman, if you want to tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I've been with KeepRite Refrigeration for about 24 years. Lucky enough to start out in refrigeration in high school, actually, but worked for a few manufacturers through my time, but working with focusing on system design, applications, and quotations with KeepRite, and currently involved with all of our software development, trying to make contractors' lives easier, trying to figure out how much refrigeration equipment they need for their walk-in coolers and freezers.
What kind of software are you working on? If you can share.
So we have homegrown software that we've developed. The overall program is called Design Tools. It's got a number of individual components to it. So we've got the load calculator. We can run spec sheets or certified prints. There's an energy calculator. There's a defrost kit and fuse package selection, such. So service parts, just a collection of different tools that will help make customers, salesmen, contractors, reps' lives easier with picking the equipment that we manufacture.
Awesome. So if you want to get right started into it, we're going to talk a little bit about the load calculation, the do's and don'ts of what not to do and what to do.
Sure. So, the biggest thing that I think people lose sight with when they want to run a load calculation is the application. And it is just so important to have a really good understanding of what the end user is going to be doing in the box, product coming in, how they're going to use the room. Is there a lot of traffic in it, a little bit of traffic? There's so many parameters that will affect the room loads. Whether it's just a general walk-in cooler, or whether it's a prep room, a refrigerated dock, a production area. In my experience, a lot of people just will run a general box load for, a cooler or a freezer, and they don't ask a whole lot of information, and equipment gets selected, sold, and then we get phone calls where, my cooler isn't cooling or something else is going on and it's getting warm, and we do an evaluation on what's going on, and someone dropped the ball somewhere and they didn't tell the contractor, or the contractor didn't ask, and found out that they're bringing in warm product that they're trying to freeze, and or they just didn't do their due diligence of figuring out everything that the customer is going to do in the room, because all of those things will affect the room load and affect, as a result, the amount of equipment that gets selected. So with our software, the very first thing that the software prompts the user for is the application. Is it a walk-in cooler? Is it a prep room? Is it a beer cooler? Is it a freezer warehouse? Because there's a lot of things in the background that we can set up with the load calc that are geared to that specific application. So it works like a template. And
I have a quick question then. So do you have anything in there as far as an instance, like a lot with pharmaceuticals, right? They typically have a like a cool down room, a pull down room, where basically if they're bringing the box, a pallet jack worth of material in there, they'll throw it in like the pre-cooler, pre-chiller before they actually stick it in the box to prevent a lot of additional humidity from being, sucked up into the coils. And I've seen where, some pharmaceutical places have not put a pre-room, to prep the product, to make sure there's not copious amounts of humidity on there.
Yeah, anti-rooms come in different uses. Sometimes it's just a small room that's in front of a freezer. Other time it's like a staging room. So it's important to know, how much product they're going to bring in, what the temperature that it's coming in at, because all of those things will affect the load for sure.
Yeah, I mean, when I used to do industrial, I started reading a lot of the Rita books. And, they had us do calculations, if you had 1,000 pounds of beef that just got slaughtered and you're trying to bring it down to freezing, there was X amount of BTUs that it was because the specific heat of that particular product was X, above freezing. And then it was, another heat rejection number, basically when you got down to freezing. So once you got it down to 32 degrees, then basically your BTU load changes of the 1,000 pounds of beef. And does your software do that with the specific heat of all the product?
Absolutely. Yeah, we've got the entire ASHRAE list of products, ice creams and beef and chicken and vegetables, fruits and vegetables. So all of those specific heats are defaulted into the program. So you just select the type of product you want. It loads up with a default entering temperature, but it's up to the user to find out what the real entering temperature is, what the proper weight is, or a good estimate of what it'll be, and modify the defaults, and then they can select the products and put it in. And one of the things with the product load, we want to find out things like, is it long-term or short-term storage? When people do Apple storage rooms, the dynamic of how you work the product load is so different than a general purpose walk-in cooler. We mentioned the product weight, how much is entering every day. So we want to figure out how much product is coming in every 24 hours, because the load calc is calculated based over a 24-hour period. We mentioned the product entering temperature. Pull down time is really important. Does it matter how long it takes for the product to cool down from 45 to 35, or do they want that done within a short hour and a half time? And so knowing that greatly affects the product load. One thing that people come to us with crazy ideas of, they want to cool this product down from, say 85 to 35 in an hour and a half. And, we can develop the theoretical load for that based upon the specific heat of the product. So we know that we can calculate theoretically it'll take X amount of BTUs to cool the product from, say, 85 to 35 in an hour and a half. The problem is, can the product actually give off its heat, in that amount of heat, in that amount of time? And that's a factor that we sometimes don't know. And unless the customer or the end user has experience with that, sometimes, we'll have to throw disclaimers on things where it's like, well, this is a theoretical number, and we can't guarantee that the product will actually be able to cool down in this amount of time, because it's going to be a function of the temperature of that the room is at as well. So if they need a really fast pull down time, you need to have the room cooler than your final product temperature. And there's a lot of factors that go into that. So,
and sometimes it's not just a regular walk-in. Farms all the time, they have those vacuum chambers where they put the cold water on the product, and it basically helps extrude that heat from the center of the core of the product, utilizing vacuums.
Yeah, and we've seen hydro coolers and such where the product goes into a water bath, and figuring out the load. This isn't a room load; it's really just a system that is dealing with the product load, trying to figure out the load on the water can be very tricky to figure out when we put warm product into a water bath and you have a chiller that's cooling the water down, because the water is absorbing the heat from the product.
Yeah, and you'd have to figure out the BTUs off of the water, the weight of the water, as well as the actual product itself, correct?
Yeah. So it's some of those are really tricky, and a lot of times you overestimate because you never want to be short, and provide a system that will provide some capacity control. So you don't want to have a single compressor system in that type of application. You want something that has multiple compressors or has unloading, something that can vary its capacity to match the load.
Gotcha. I'm sorry for all the questions. This is one subject that I don't know very much about. I usually end up calling someone else that's smarter than me, and hey, walk me through it. Let's see if we can figure out the load.
Yeah,
right?
and equipment selection, you could spend 2 hours talking about how to select the right type of equipment for all the different types of applications as well. But one thing that people forget about product load is the packaging material and skids and racking and trays that some of the product may come in on. People forget that you bring produce into a walk-in cooler and it's got a lot of field heat in it, but that stuff's in cardboard boxes or in wooden crates, and the crate is 95 degrees. So you may have thousands of pounds of product, but you could also have hundreds of pounds of skid wood. And that's one thing that people sometimes forget about, is you not only have to cool down the product, but the packaging material that the product is in. So that's
have you ever had a production facility like that where they ended up changing the scheme of how they did things, and then essentially put more of a load than what the system was designed for, and then had a problem because of it?
Usually it's not. Sometimes, yeah, what they estimate the product to be isn't what it is, or oftentimes what'll happen is it's overestimated. So we end up with a system that ends up being grossly oversized just because they provided incorrect information. Or what will happen is the number may be correct. The number is 3 years from now where they plan to be. So they try to future proof the equipment selection, but the person that's making the selection, salesman, rep, or inside sales guy, they don't know that that's happened. So they'll select a system that may not be able to ramp down in capacity effectively and run unloaded for an extended period of time. Which of course, you don't want a compressor with cylinder unloading running unloaded all the time. That's going to pose all kinds of other mechanical problems. So getting the system and the application and the design of the load correct, and knowing how the system is all going to work, or how the room needs to work, will greatly affect the equipment selection. And that's it's important to get all of that information up front and as accurate as possible, because maybe the guy needed 3 smaller compressors instead of 1 big one, right? That affects a lot of stuff. Is that future planning can cause a problem for the system running today. So yeah, those are product load pitfalls. Wall construction, oftentimes you have old boxes that are 20, 30 years old. No one knows what the material is. But it's important to try to figure out, get the accurate wall thickness. If you can, what's the type of insulation? The insulation factor of styrofoam versus polyurethane is a big difference. And on a small walk-in that's 10 by 10, it's not going to make a big difference in your load estimate. But a very large warehouse, that's going to make a big difference, because we have a lot more square footage of that wall. And it's important to know the type of insulation. Is it just spray foamed? We know that, they'll say there's 4 inches of spray foam, but it's not going to be even 4 inches everywhere. Some will have 4, some will have 6, some will have 3. It'll be a little bit all over the place. So knowing that, you can augment your load calculation a little bit to adjust for those inconsistencies. So knowing your panel and material thickness is really important to the wall loads.
So what's the R value difference between, you said polyurethane, and what was the other one you said?
Styrofoam.
Yeah. What's the R value difference? Like, if it was the same thickness?
I could look that up to see. Our software uses, R value is the resistance to heat transfer over a specific thickness.
Okay.
Generally, we use, all the load calc programs generally will use the U factor, because that's as a per thickness value.
Okay.
And, there's a particular U value for a particular insulating material. And you would just define it's either 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 inches, or whatever it happens to be. And then it calculates the number over that.
Gotcha.
R value is usually, R value will be converted into the U factor and then used in the math. So
all right.
So R value divided by the thickness to get the U factor.
Does that software have the ability to calculate like air changes for, like, say you have exhaust fans in a room, like say you're doing like a prep room with exhaust fans?
Yeah, we can get into infiltration. So, there's 3 types of, historically, 3 calculation methods for infiltration. One is the old school ASHRAE air changes per hour based upon the room temperature and the volume. So they have charts. There's a chart that says, X number of air changes per hour. And so you can estimate infiltration based upon that. You can estimate the infiltration through doors and openings, and you can accurately estimate that based upon the open time, how long it takes for the door to open, how long it's fully open. But there are factors that you don't know how long it takes for a door to swing open and closed, unless you have the specific numbers on a high-speed door. But how long is the door fully open, to calculate the CFM coming in through that open space can be tricky to estimate. But that's a methodology that is utilized by the software. And of course, the third is the one you mentioned, which is just specifically CFM. So you can specify a CFM and an entering air temperature to calculate the, that part of the infiltration load. And the idea is that the load calculation software will take the highest of the three if you entered all three. But yeah, if you've got an exhaust fan or a makeup air system that's going into the specific space, we don't see a lot of that. But if you do have that in a prep area where people are working and you need a certain amount of CFM coming into the space, what is the CFM and what is the entering air temperature and humidity? And then, yeah, you calculate the amount of heat that's required because you have to cool that air down to the room temperature. So in the perfect world, you would have some other kind of system that would pre-cool that. You don't want to be bringing 75-degree air into a 35-degree cooler. It needs to be cooled down prior before entering in the space. We've seen bad things happen because what will happen is people will think that they can do that, and then they put that where the location where that air comes right in behind the evaporator coil because they think that's a really good idea because we're going to cool it down really quickly. And what happens is, of course, is that coil just gets frosted up because there's so much humidity coming in, and it's going to do the latent cooling first, and the coil becomes a ball of ice and they can't defrost it.
Amazing.
Yeah, we had a massive packaging facility where this exact thing happened. It was designed, and some exhaust fans were added or missed by the design engineer. And I mean, it wasn't a ton of exhaust, but it was enough exhaust where it made a negative draw into the room. And it almost, I would say, almost doubled the load in the room.
Damn.
Like they had to have a man door open all the time inside this. This is a massive box, or else it would suck the Ravac door, automatic doors in.
Yeah, it's a problem. People, in production facilities, like for example, like a sausage produce, production facility. There's a lot of product going in between boxes, and we've been asked to calculate loads, and we're like, well, you ask information about the door, and then they tell you there really is no door. It's just strip curtains. And, but it's warm on the other side of the space. And you have this, uncontrolled air movement and humidity movement from one space into another. And people think they can leave doors open or not put doors on at all. And you can calculate the theoretical, but the number becomes so large, sometimes you can't fit the equipment in the space. And sometimes it's hard to convince people that this is just not going to work. You can't do that. But they have it in their mind that they think they can.
The software should just default to door open for 8 hours.
Yeah, we ended up having to add. We're doing it right now. We had to add 8 massive coils in this room to help supplement the room because they can't keep up. Anytime the humidity is above 50%, like it's in a semi-conditioned warehouse, but like anytime the humidity gets high, like the room, you could graph a room, it just slowly climbs as soon as the humidity gets higher. Mm-hmm. As soon as they shut the exhaust fans off, the room shoots down like a rock.
Yeah. And humidity is the latent load on a coil is quite large. A lot of the cooling comes from that, and it's got to get rid of it. It collects on the coil. Hopefully, it goes down the drain. Assuming they have the drain pipe correctly, but that's a whole other conversation for another day.
Do you want to kind of touch on how latent load does affect coils? I mean, because that's something a lot of guys don't understand, and I mean, it really does affect a lot of stuff. Even in a grocery store application with a case, latent load really affects your cooling huge.
Yeah, for the most part, the latent, the water that is in the air is going to collect on the coil. So it's going to show up as frost or ice on the fins and the tubes. So what happens is if there's too much humidity in the space, if there's too much latent load, those coils will load up with frost and ice very quickly. And of course, that frost is going to impede heat transfer. So the more that builds up, the less heat transfer surface is available to absorb heat. And the system just doesn't end up having the capacity that it should, because the coil can't absorb it can't drop the temperature. You're just collecting more and more frost on the coil, and you don't end up dropping the temperature in the space. And the coil will go, depending on the system, the coil will go into defrost. Well, if it's a time clock system, you have no control. It's going to go 3-4 times a day. We've seen demand defrost systems where the coil was almost in defrost as much time as it was in refrigeration because of the latent load. So it was in refrigeration, then it was in defrost, and it was in refrigeration, then in defrost. And because the demand system was taking a look at suction temperature and coil temp and all the things that it figures out, its little magic thing to figure out how often it needs to be defrosted. And there wasn't enough runtime to cool the room sufficiently. So that's the worst case scenario, is that you're just frosted up more than it impedes the coil capacity too much. Yeah.
We had a system like that. It was originally designed for electric defrost. So the fins per inch were real tiny. It was, excuse me, I believe it was 6 fins per inch. And, if I would have had my say, like walk-ins, I think they should have, more or less fins per inch, especially if they know they're going to be pulling out a lot more humidity out of the air. So you're less likely to ice up. Well, this facility, they had smoke removal fans. And in the summertime, what they would do is in the non-refrigerated part of the warehouse, they would turn it on. Well, as soon as they would open up the walk-in speed door where the trucks would back up to the big donuts that prevent the air from coming in, it had so much suction on there, it would actually start pulling it apart and pulling a large, latent heat load of moisture and heat inside the thing and start everything icing up. Mm-hmm. And so even though they're electric defrost, I think we have them set for off-time defrost for 10 or 12 times a day, because they just refuse to keep those fans on.
Yeah, frosting coils can be a big problem. A lot of that may also have to do with the fan motor and blade combination and the airflow across the coil. So a lot of that, the design of the evaporator will have a lot of effect on how much frost can build up on the coil before it's a real problem, and how quickly that happens, for sure.
So since you're talking about frost, I know that Kevin has seen this. I know I have, where you have excessive frost buildup on the distributor tubes, typically after a retrofit where it was R22, and let's just say they changed it from 448 to 449. The response I got from a manufacturer, and I just want to verify with you, when you change that refrigerant, basically there's too much boiling off going on in the distributors, which is causing the excessive frosting there, rather than in the coil, because the nozzle would have to be opened up a little bit.
Well, there's a lot of factors there. If we're switching from 22 or 404A to a new refrigerant popular today, like say a 407A or 448A or 449A, one thing that needs to be considered is, of course, the glide. And so what happens with the glide is, of course, that refrigerant with an R22 or 404A system, if your evap temp is designed to be 25 and your suction is 25, well, they're both the same temperature. Let's exclude pressure drop in the suction line right now, right? Mm-hmm. So the refrigerant leaving the TX valve is 25-degree liquid, and it evaporates in the evaporator at 25 degrees and goes back to the compressor as a vapor at 25 degrees. With a high glide refrigerant, it's entering the coil if your glide is 11 degrees, it's entering the coil 5 degrees colder than you think it is.
So let's, for argument's sake, let's say that the suction is set up right for the midpoint.
So, and it may be, but you're still entering the evaporator colder than, because of losses, you're entering the coil at 20 degrees and it's warming up in the evaporator through the midpoint, up to what the compressor has to run at. So it warms up to dew. And so you just have colder refrigerant entering the evaporator. So that can lead to excessive frost on the distributor feeds. Different refrigerants, depending on the operating conditions, we circuit coils differently. So we'll change the number of distributor feeds off the distributor into the coil, depending on operating conditions. So, on some of those retrofits, that's not possible. So you live with what you've got. So you could have a system where you have a little bit higher pressure drop in those distributor feeds than what might be ideal, and combine that with the refrigerant entering at a colder temperature, and it has to warm up to the temperature that the compressor is operating at. You can have excessive frosting. It may not affect the distribution so much inside the evaporator, but you could just end up with a lot more frosting on the distributor than you saw with a conventional refrigerant. It may not impact the capacity of the coil that you can tell.
Here's question number 2 for Field Pieces giveaway. What's the required superheat for a Copeland compressor? What is the minimum superheat you're allowed to have without damaging the compressor? Today's episode is sponsored by the new ReefreShield differential pressure monitor from Westermeyer Industries. When the filter element of your coalescing oil separator is contaminated, it can hurt your system's performance and efficiency. But how do you know when it's time to replace that filter? Wait too long to replace and you could end up with a nasty filter blowout. But replacing too often can be a waste of time and money. The answer is installing a differential pressure monitor. The new ReefreShield RDP-01 differential pressure monitor is available now from Westermeyer Industries. To find out more information, email sales@westermeyerind.com. That's sales@westermeyerind.com.
But that could definitely be one of the reasons why you see that.
Okay.
Yeah.
It's where TXV cabinet heaters come in.
Yeah. As long as you include it in the room load estimate.
Well, you said you have that buffer space in there, so that a little bit of room heat in there. When it goes into defrost, we'll be fine.
On freezers now, just about probably half the coils we install, we end up putting, if it's electric defrost, we end up putting a custom made cabinet heater in the TXV section to keep them from icing up, because it's become such a problem.
It grows so bad it goes in the suction line, right?
Yeah, eventually it builds so much in the distributor because nobody has enough heat, because they're all trying to make these energy standards. Nobody has enough heat on the TXV side to get the cabinet warm enough to melt the ice off the distributors. So what ends up happening is it starts growing from the distributors to the coil, and then you get this icing up behind the fans eventually. And no matter what, every electric defrost coil does it.
Really?
Over time. It may take a year, it may take a year and a half, it may take 6 months, it may take 3 months, depending on how the defrost is. But we end up installing cabinet heaters in there, and little U-shaped heaters. They draw like half an amp to an amp, and they completely solve the problem.
On those coils that you see, does the drain pan heater come out into that refrigeration end compartment where the TX valve is?
Some of them do, some of them don't. Some of them have longer, like Crackle have they'll 45 kick the coil heaters. They'll like 45 kick it into the cabinet a little bit. But Bone will have them sticking into the drain pan a little bit. It'll be sticking on there, but it's still even I've even had some issues with KeepRite coils. Same thing, not getting, after a while it just doesn't get warm enough on that end. And it eventually ends up like building ice.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, it's possible. The new refrigerants can, it's a big learning curve. So all kinds of little things crop up sometimes. But
Now, is there a difference? Like some manufacturers, for when they're sizing distributor, they usually do about 35 psi change. A pressure drop across the distributor. Is that what you use for your staple?
I'd have to look at. Yeah, the old school was 35 pounds in the distributor. Yeah, so I believe we still use that for the starting point distributor pressure drop. But of course, it's the total pressure drop across the distributor, the nozzle, and the TX valve that everything is sized to. So there is some room to play there sometimes, for sure.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Yeah.
What do you want to cover next? I'm sorry.
Yeah, where are we on my list here? So we spoke about temperatures. One thing with walls. So when we look at walls where we have, like, say, combination cooler freezers, or a large facility that has a lot of boxes that are right next to each other, one thing that a lot of people will do is they run load calcs. You do an individual load calc for each walk-in space, and people leave the default external temperature at whatever the default is for the software. If it's an indoor space, usually like 85 degrees. If it's outdoor, it's 95. But depending on how accurate you want to make your load estimate, and ideally you want to make it as accurate as possible, because generally speaking, the more accurate your load estimate is, the smaller the equipment you'll end up selecting. And so you want to make sure that you take into consideration, if you have a walk-in cooler next to a freezer, that you take the credit on that wall. So you want to ensure that you change the defaults in the software to account for the external temperature on that specific wall section. So if you have 4 boxes next to each other, you've got a lot of common walls. You don't want to put 85 degrees around each of the rooms, because that's not really what's happening. Those middle rooms have coolers on either side, so there's really no heat transfer on 2 of the walls. So you can put smaller systems into the middle rooms than you would on the outside. So some people like to do that. I usually suggest it, because if the system is oversized and it's a cooler, if it runs and shuts off on the thermostat quickly, we run into oil problems, but you can also end up with humidity and moisture problems in the space, and you don't want mold growing on the walls because the system isn't running long enough to remove the moisture that's coming into the space. So where you can, take the credit on the walls. Make sure that you have an accurate external temperature on each of the wall sections.
Okay.
It's a neat little trick to keep things even.
Now, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Nope. I was just going to go into one of the next things with our load calcs, are miscellaneous loads, things that people forget about, like people. Are the people working hard or hardly working? And how many people are doing that? Forklifts. How many forklifts are there? Are they electric or propane? Because the heat that comes off some of those are different than others. The number of hours that they're running. And other equipment in the room, packaging equipment, if there's a conveyor, those types of things need to be accounted for in the refrigerated space, because that can affect the amount of equipment that you put in there, for sure. And the one thing that you also want to take into consideration are the evaporator fan motors. So you need to ensure that when you run your load calculation, that you're including the wattage for the fan motors that are on the equipment that you're selecting. So, most load programs will throw a default number in there. Depending on the room size, it'll say, well, there's 6 motors at whatever, 1500 watts, whatever the number happens to be. And that's a good starting point. But I always suggest people take a look at, once you make your equipment selection, you can easily look at the wattage of the fan motors on the evaporators that you've selected and go back and correct your load estimate to properly reflect those. That
Oh,
can
so
that
if you're looking at a new redoing your box, right, and you had X amount of load, and now that you're putting newer equipment in, you could probably get the ECM motors or the lower wattage motors, and then recalculate your whole box, per the product that you just selected, right?
Mhm.
Okay.
Yeah, the wattage consumption of an EC motor is much less than a conventional motor or like a PSC motor or a regular three-phase motor. And so that can make a big difference. And even when you're running your load calc the first time, it's important if you're doing a blast cell that's not a lot of internal square footage, but you're going to have a lot of high wattage motors in a very small space, the default program may not reflect that correctly. So you want to double check the motor wattage and go back and correct it in the software.
So when you select some of these things that you're doing, like as far as how quick you're pulling down the product, let's just say you are doing a blast freezer, you're taking, or you're taking 400-degree food that just came out and making it go down to 0 degrees. Are you supposed to use a higher speed fan so you can move more air, more load across that coil in order to accomplish that? Like, will the software actually figure that out?
No, you need to know that that's what's going on so that you can pick the appropriate type of equipment.
Okay.
So, having a reasonable amount of product knowledge for the equipment that you're selecting is important in those specialty applications, because in a blast cell, you need a lot of CFM, and you need to push that CFM through the product. So you need a lot of CFM, and you need fans that can push against some static. Conventional axial fans don't develop much static. So you need to make sure you have the right style evaporator with the right fan and blade combination that will be able to push against upwards of 1 inch of static depending on the product. Because a lot of times those blast cells, they'll have a false ceiling, there'll be a drop ceiling. So you have the product in the middle of the room, there'll be a suspended ceiling that sets up a plenum so that you have air go through the product and circulate back around to the back of the coil. So that develops a lot of static. There'll be turning vanes in the corners, so that you get a nice even flow of air through the product and back around to the coil. So that takes a lot of static, and you need to make sure that you've got the right one selected. So you need to go and check the wattage of those motors and then correct your load calc, because that in some of those applications it might change the condensing unit you need, because you're adding so much additional motor heat to the room. Yeah.
All right.
Yep. So where are we? Equipment selection. I mentioned application plays a large role in the type of evap that you selected, that gets selected, like those blast cells. Prep rooms, you want, low velocity coils. No one wants to be working in a space and having cold air blown on them, ideally. So picking the right type of coil for the application is important. And then, what's also really important in those systems is making sure that the evap selection is correct to give you the TD on the coil that you're looking for. So, TD is temperature difference. That's the difference between the room temperature and the evaporating temperature in the coil. So whether that's mathed out to be dew or mid, depending on the manufacturer, it's all a little bit different these days. I'm trying to coin the phrase, 7 is the new 10 with our high glide refrigerants. What you designed before for a 10-degree TD, you're going to be looking to maybe make those selections at a slightly lower TD to ensure that you have enough coil surface to evaporate all the different refrigerants at all the different temperatures as they work themselves through the coil.
So, and a higher TD is going to give you a higher humidity, correct? Because you're not absorbing nearly as much humidity on the coil.
It's the other way around. A higher TD will give you a lower humidity. A lower TD will give you a higher humidity. And that's because, so take, for example, our 35-degree room, conventional 25-degree evap temp is a 10-degree TD. Okay. So if I want to remove more moisture from the air, I need to drop the coil temp. Okay. So that is an increase in my TD. So if I have my evap running at 20 degrees versus 25, I've moved from a 10 to a 15 degree TD, and I will end up with a lower relative humidity in the space. Because the coil is operating at a lower temperature, I will be able to remove more moisture because I'm going to collect more of it on the evaporator.
Okay, that makes sense.
And so the other way around, if I have a, for, let's say, because normally lower room temperature, lower TD, higher room temperature, higher TD. So if I have a 40 degree, so my 35 degree example wasn't the best, but like in a prep room where I may want more moisture because it's vegetables and other such things that are in there. I don't want to dry it out. So I want a shorter TD on that. Okay. So my suction temp is higher because the room temp is going to be constant. So what can you try to vary with the system design is the evap temp. So with a shorter TD that's 8 degrees, I will end up with a higher relative humidity because the suction temp is higher.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, that makes more sense.
Yeah, it's initially backwards when you think about it, but that's the way those work. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm aware like what happens to capacity when you take a, let's just say 1 ton coil, and it's a 1 ton coil at a 10 degree TD. It's a 120 BTU unit at a 1 degree TD, and then at a 20 degree TD would basically be about 2 tons. I fully understood that. I didn't understand the whole humidity. I've never had to worry about it. I just, always get everything working within design of what it was originally designed, and then it ends up working.
Yeah. And, you combine with, you have all these design conditions, but, sometimes in the field, you can't measure a one degree difference in evap temp, even though on a 10 degree TD coil, that's 10%, right?
Yeah.
So it's, yeah.
The coil would have to be huge to do a 1 degree TD.
Well, yeah, you wouldn't practically. It's just not. Yeah, it's not going to be possible because you need temperature difference in order to do the heat transfer, right?
Absolutely.
So for sure. Walking through low velocity in prep rooms. We spoke about blast cells. You need high velocity and air changes to get the heat out of the product quickly.
So is there also a setting, because I've seen this in some very large walk-ins where they'll actually have looks almost like a 5-gallon bucket that was cut out and put on the end of the coil to help with throw, to get more air throwing across the room. Can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, throw booster. So they're offered on a variety of different evaporators, usually larger evaporators because they do impose some static. And but what will happen is instead of having a conventional wire guard on the fan panel, the air going through the evaporator, through the fan, and it just gets sprayed out in all different kinds of directions. So if you have a throw booster on the fan outlet, then that's going to direct the air straighter and increase the throw. So you end up directing the air straighter. It doesn't spread out over a wider area. It directs it straighter, so it goes further longer.
So if you had a box that was having a hard time getting temperatures at other ends, you could just put the throw booster on. Do you have to do any change in the load calculation? Is there going to be something different with the amount of watts coming from the fans?
No, the wattage on the motors doesn't change, but what can happen is because and it's going to vary by manufacturer to manufacturer and vary on the evaporator as well. But because those throw boosters impose static, it reduces your CFM as a result. And reduction in CFM gives you a reduction in evaporator capacity.
Okay.
So you could lose, upwards of 10 to 15% of your evaporator capacity with a throw booster, depending on the coil and depending on the design.
So you would have, so in designing it, if you know that you need to be able to throw that air, X amount of feet, right? You need that throw booster on. You'd actually have to, if you had 6 evaporators, 15. 3,000.
Yeah, you need to pick the right
4,500 more
evaporator
BTUs.
with the throw. You want to pick the evaporator with the throw booster
Yeah.
so that the correction is made for you. So
Oh, okay. So
yeah,
when you select that, okay, all right.
yeah. So when you're, at least with our software, you pick your condensing unit first. You match the condensing unit capacity to the load requirement, and then
Mhm.
you pick the evaporator to match to the condensing unit at your specified design TD. So the software knows what the capacity of every single evaporator is. It knows that this evaporator with this throw booster has a X BTU reduction factor, so it takes that into consideration. So when you pick the throw booster evaporator, it's already derated the coil capacity accordingly. So you might need to bump up a size, maybe you don't. It depends on what the balance capacity is, where that evaporator balanced with that condensing unit, where the TD ended up.
And that software is the KeepRite Refrigeration design tool software?
Yeah, the load calculation software. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So you can run a load estimate if you already know the load. Like a lot of industrial jobs use rules of thumb, so they'll have a certain number of BTUs per square foot or cubic foot of the space, and oftentimes that's a very conservative number, so you end up with a lot of extra capacity. But so if you have a number, if you just know that, hey, I need 25 tons at this condition, you can also put that number into the software, and then you can make your equipment selection based upon that.
And it looks like this is all web based. There's no software to actually download.
Yeah, we're in the middle of rewriting the software completely. So we've gotten, our first stage was rewriting the load program. So it was a piece of software that you would have to download and install on a Windows machine.
Mm-hmm.
And, over time, with the way the world works, everyone has internet everywhere and different operating systems, different hardware. And a lot of customers of ours have, these big companies and corporations have, they're behind really big heavy duty firewalls, and, at wholesalers aren't allowed to just install whatever program they want at the branch.
Mm-hmm.
So, the requirement to have the piece of software run in a browser became very evident. So yeah, the load program runs in a browser, so it doesn't matter if you're on a Windows machine, whether it's Linux, if it's a Macintosh, it'll just run in your browser. So we're slowly rewriting all of the tools to work in that type of environment. So yeah. Yeah.
I'm gonna have to play around with this later. Now I'm curious.
Yeah, we're in the middle of creating some videos that will steer the, like educational little 3-minute snippets of how you do this, how do you do this, how do you do this in the software. A lot of people don't want to watch a lengthy tutorial on how to run a load calc, but we found breaking it up into little bits and pieces, then that makes the consumption of the information a lot more palatable to people. So I'm in the middle of creating little snippet videos and things, and you'll start seeing that on social media, and it'll be collected on the YouTube channel for the product line and such.
Wonderful. I look forward to it. So looks like we went through everything. The only thing else I wanted to talk about was the two-speed two-speed evaporators, because I know a lot of guys have been having issues with it. Not necessarily yours, because you have it set up where it's going to run high speed no matter what if nothing's done. Some of these other manufacturers do have it where it's running low speed by standard. Unless they run power or pull this or whatever have you to fix it. So correct me if I'm wrong. So this is what I'm gathering. Typically during refrigeration, if ever any refrigerant's moving through it, it needs to be running high speed. If it's in defrost, it needs to be running high speed. But if it's just satisfying, like if it's something that's going off a thermostat, that's the only time that evaporator is really supposed to be running at a low speed. Correct?
You were almost right on all of that. So yes, when it's in refrigeration, the fan should be running full speed.
Yeah.
If the coil is in defrost, obviously, if it's electric defrost or hot gas, the fans will be off. If it's an off time defrost, then, whether it's, the refrigeration is off just on the thermostat, or whether there's a time clock that's forced an air defrost off time. The conventional setup on our evaporators is that the fans do run at part speed during that off time air defrost. I know that with the testing that our engineering department has done, they spent a lot of time figuring out, well, what's the balance between having more than enough airflow across the coil to defrost the coil within a reasonable amount of time.
Okay.
That off time where you really don't want it lasting much more than 30 minutes of off time defrost. Fail safes will kick in around 40 or 45. But so what's that balance of providing enough airflow, but also dropping that CFM and airflow and RPM to drop the motor wattage to gain energy savings? Because that's where that comes from, is that motor running at its lower speed is where you get a big chunk of your energy savings. So our EC motors drop to, I believe, 60% of the RPM. So that provides still enough CFM across the coil to sufficiently defrost the coil during those off-time defrost periods under, a variety of frosting conditions.
See, that's where I thought, I honestly thought that you'd want to run it at least in high speed during defrost, because otherwise, like, if the allotted time on let's just say you took the older style coil that didn't have the 2-speed, and then you have another one that's 2-speed, and let's just say you're running 200 CFM through that thing, all the time, and then you put it in defrost. I think that if you'd had one running at full speed and the other one running at half speed, the full speed one would in fact defrost faster because you're shoveling more air volume through there. Yeah.
It'll definitely defrost faster. That is correct. That's correct.
So, but the defrost are still not set up. Like, because if you look at both coils, you think that the defrost would be a little bit lengthier of a time for one that's running at a mid speed or lower speed. For that, is that the case? Like, if you took the two exact model numbers, one had the 2-speed motors that run during defrost, the other one, didn't. Are those in the IOM manuals? Are they going to say, okay, this one needs to be in defrost for 45 minutes, this one needs to be in for an hour?
No, you can't really qualify the amount of time that it would be in defrost, because the amount of frost that's collected on the coil at the outset of defrost is going to greatly affect that, along with the room temperature. So each installation site is going to be a little bit different. Some coils may be free of frost in 20 minutes. Some might take 30. Some might need the full 45.
Mm-hmm.
So, we can't say how long it's going to take, because you don't know. Every job is going to be a little bit different. If there are job sites that have issues with the coils defrosting on that off time, then the coil can be set up so that it just doesn't go into part speed when the thermostat is satisfied. That is always the option, that people can disable that 2-speed function. But with the AWIF requirements, annual walk-in efficiency factor, that's imposed by the DOE in the US and NRCan in Canada, that all the evaporators have these new efficiency ratings, and the use of those 2-speed motors was fundamental in order to get the efficiency of the equipment to the specifications that the manufacturers were told your coils need to meet this efficiency rating. And so they leave the factory set up in order to meet those efficiency requirements. And so as a manufacturer, we strongly suggest that they stay in place to provide those efficiency ratings to the end user.
And what did you say it was called up in Canada?
NRCan. So I should know what that means. That's National National Resources Canada.
Okay.
That's what that,
you said
NR,
Narcan?
NRCan. Yeah.
Okay.
That's my Canadian accent blended those letters together.
Gotcha.
Yeah, Natural Resources Canada, and the DOE in the US is what those governing bodies.
We've been having a lot of problems with a lot of the AWF stuff because, they're not, the supply houses, it seems like they're still sizing it, how they would old school, where they're not watching, they're sizing it a little bit bigger because, like a place like Texas, you have to be able to have the same BTU capacity at 120 degree outside to give you like 140 degree saturated. And then you're running all the way down to potentially 55, 60 degree saturated with, 110 pound, head pressure. Right. So a lot of times what happens is, cause they're doing the floating head, but they're killing their suction, they're killing the TD of the coil, and then making a lot of these coils starve because, you're basically running a larger TD, and then in turn your valve isn't big enough. If you've seen electronic expansion valves at 100%, and still struggle to achieve, manufacturer spec superheat on that particular unit, because of the BTU sizing that happens when you're running that low of a head pressure. Your compressor increases so much in capacity.
That's right. Yeah. And a lot of systems, it's advantageous to either have a parallel system where you can shed a compressor to maintain that load balance between the capacity of the system and the load in the room, because oftentimes it's a double whammy. You have, in the wintertime, you have more capacity on the system, but less load in the walk-in, because everything around the box is colder. Product is coming in off the truck's colder. Everything is colder.
Yeah.
And so you just don't have the load. And so you have systems that don't run properly. They flood back. They start to cycle too much. So you end up having oil problems. And
they'll frost up and ice up perpetually.
Yeah. That with systems that you float the head, you now don't have the pressure drop across the TX valve that you did at the design point. So, sometimes it's a good suggestion to go to. This is where the drive for some of that variable capacity compressors come in, like the digital scroll, right? Where the scroll can modulate to meet essentially the load in the space. That can come with its own problems, but ultimately, capacity control is the solution to that. So you have the system that is designed at peak condition, and when you run at low loads, it has to adjust and reduce its capacity to meet the lower load condition, because you have the system inherently has more capacity because of the lower condensing temp. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So either going to multiple smaller systems, so you just shut a system off, which is really the best way to save energy, is not to have the system run at all, versus having a compressor that has a larger motor that is turning on and off, essentially, or loading up or unloading. It's better to have multiple systems or multiple compressors where you can just shed a whole compressor.
See, when they did the AWF stuff, I think they should have did more suction capacity control, whether it be digital compressor, one parallel, compressor to the other one, so you have that different capacity, or, even as far as doing a hot gas desuperheating back at the condensing unit to help, to help keep that suction pressure up, so we don't have the loading issues that we might have.
Yeah. The regulations are around system equipment efficiencies, and so wattage in versus wattage out, essentially. So, how the manufacturers go about achieving that is up to each of the individual manufacturers. So, you can make a system efficient. It's tricky to make it efficient and across a quite a large operating range, right? Because the refrigeration system, condenser unit, medium temp condenser unit will run at 40 suction or 0 suction, right? So it has to meet those energy regulations across its entire operating range, from 110 ambient down to 85 ambient as a rating point. And then, you combine that with floating the head and low temp winter operation. It makes it difficult to have a system that's going to work perfect in all conditions. So it ends up being up to the person that's making the equipment selections to go, well, instead of having one 40 horsepower compressor, I'm going to pick, two 20s or two 15s, whatever that matchup is, right? So that you don't have one big system that's struggling. You can have two smaller systems, and one runs all the time, the other one cycles on as it needs to. So you end up with a more even temperature and room condition, and you're not stressing the system.
Well, a lot of times the end users is the ones that they're designing, what system they want in their, in their store, and not realizing with all these other changes that there are things it's not running the same way that it used to for all the AWEF standards.
Yeah, and you combine that with the new refrigerants with the Glide, and it just changes everything. Yeah,
absolutely,
for sure.
Kevin, do you have anything else for Norman?
No, not really. I mean, he answered a lot of the questions that I had.
Norman, I got to tell you, this was awesome. I appreciate you coming on and going through all this. I might have you on again just to maybe do a video to go through, like, actually doing a load calc.
Sure, absolutely.
That.
Yeah, that'd be great for sure.
All right.
Yep. Thanks for coming on, Norman.
All right. Thanks so much.
Guys. Have a good night.
Hey, you're home early.
This place is a wreck. Who are these girls?
They're hookers, so it's fine.
What the hell is this?
Oh, my God, where are my manners? Laurie, this is Angelique, Heavenly, Shireen, and Sauvignon Blanc. I love you girls. Somewhere out there are 4 terrible fathers I wish I could thank for this great